So we're going to be talking about alternative planning options. So both environmental management systems and resource conservation plans. We've been having conversations with planners and with other stakeholders with the program about, about the planning process and what can the program be doing to improve the planning process for you. And so one of the things that we've been hearing and looking at as we looked at, kind of the demographics over the years of what people are doing throughout the state is that the number of companies choosing either one of these alternative planning options has been steadily going down. So there may be very good reasons for that, and it may simply be that there are some misconceptions about both of those options. And certainly there are probably ways that we can be improving these options. But what we wanted to do in this session is to really talk about what the options are and why you might really want to take another look at considering doing them. And so the panel is here really to talk about what the advantages are, why they've chosen to do that. And so that's what we're going to be doing. So we're going to start off, we're going to hear from Bill Judd, who's going to walk through the environmental management system for the TURA program, talk a little bit about, why he thinks there's advantages to doing it. Then we're going to hear from Sandra Wyman, who's going to talk about resource conservation and provide some examples of why doing resource conservation was a real benefit to some of her clients. And then we're going to open up the panel. We have 3 companies who are going to be here talking about their experiences. We have Brian Pazel from Msi Transducers, and we have Will Finch from CB Fisk. And we also have Kathy Benjamin, who's going to talk about her experience at Jetex in using the TURA EMS. We also have another planner who's joining us, Beth Fitzpatrick, who's going to, be able to just talk a bit about why she's been able to recommend these alternative, planning options to her clients. So that's what we're going to do in the next hour and a half. And what I'm going to do is I will stop sharing. And Bill, if you could go ahead and, did I stop sharing? There. If you could go ahead and share your screen. And I will give you the 2-minute warning. And if you want to do a slideshow view rather than, yeah.
I'm gonna head there in just a second. First of all, thanks everybody for being here today. It's beautiful out. Hopefully you guys had a chance to get out at lunch for a few minutes anyway. But what I wanted to show you quickly, you can look on the left-hand side. What I would go over typically in the beginning of one of these training sessions are all the specific elements of a TURA EMS, and this takes a while to do this. And these sessions are 15 minutes long. So I just wanted to point out that those slides are there at the end if you want to go and look at those at a little bit later date. Okay, so first of all, a lot of the information that I've put into this presentation, I've taken from the Ems Planning Guidance, and there's a link below, and 626/2018 is the most current version of it. TURA has been around since 1989, but until 2006, the TURA program, the only option you had was to develop an initial TURA plan and do TURA plan updates every couple of years. There were quite a few amendments made to the TURA statute in 2006. And one of them was to allow people who had prepared a TURA plan and at least 2 plan updates, so that's 3 cycles, the option to do an alternative plan. One of those is an environmental management system that integrates toxic use reduction planning in lieu of the TURA plan updates. Allows companies that have established an EMS to integrate TURA into their system. Let's see, I need to figure out how to get rid of it. There we go. Okay, let's cover my presentation. Okay. So an EMS is a systematic approach to effectively integrate environmental considerations into an organization's day-to-day operations and management culture. The EMS structure recognizes environmental and economic performance are directly related. An EMS offers the opportunity for a facility to integrate its chemical and product quality management and planning efforts so that the focus is not just on hazardous chemicals and waste, but on the prudent use of all materials and resources by the organization. Some of the frameworks that were used initially to develop EMS was the ISO 14001 and responsible care. There's 17 elements in an ISO 14001 system, and the Tier EMS contains 14 of those. I put together a little comparative chart that you can look at. The Tier EMS, those are the elements in the correct order. The ISO 14001 EMS, I had to reorder those to make them fit, but the blue boxes, I wanted you to see the difference in an ISO 14001. EMS documentation control is actually combined in a Tier EMS. And the EMS audit and nonconformance and corrective and preventive actions are also combined. And the one individual element that's in an ISO 14001 is records, and the Tier does not have a separate category.
Bill, you're muted.
Sorry, you're on mute.
Am I back?
Yes.
Okay, sorry about that. All right, so this again assumes you already have a 14001 EMS type program in place, and to get that to a Tier EMS, you're going to have to make some modifications. To the policy itself, you're going to have to commit to pollution prevention through source reduction, and take a real good hard look at your environmental performance too, which can be an issue for certain companies and a stumbling block to doing one of these. Talk more about that in a few minutes. The focus on pollution prevention through source reduction of Tier listed chemicals and other toxic is a pivotal component of the Tier EMS as an alternative to Tier planning. Aspects and impacts. And EMS, this is a process where companies evaluate various activities, operations, identifying those that based on the company's own rating system warrant classification as significant. For a Tier EMS, all covered reportable toxic substances must be identified as significant aspects. And this includes potentially reportable toxics to ensure that any covered toxic will indeed be classified as significant. So potentially reportable, a difference here in Tier planning, as we all know, you have to trip a reporting threshold. And then for anything you trip a reportable threshold on, you have to plan on that and prepare Tier plan summary sheets. But for the Tier EMS, if you're using that listed chemical at all, it's a potentially reportable toxic. So it still has to be listed in your EMS as significant. Auditing, the Tier EMS requires auditing on at least a 2-year cycle by an independent auditor, and that senior management reviews the audit results. And these are two important criteria. If I was given a test today, this would be a test question. And I don't know what Pam has planned either for this. But the audit program must include procedures for preventing detective nonconformance with legal other requirements, procedures for implementing corrective actions to ensure compliance and commitment. To ensure that the company's independent EMS auditor is familiar with the particular Tier aspects of the EMS, the company needs to review its EMS audit procedures to ensure that the auditors consider the Tier elements of the EMS. Elements of audit procedures and modifications that may be necessary for the purpose and scope. It must contain source reduction. In terms of responsibilities, there must be an EMS professional who certifies the EMS progress report. Defined responsibilities in the audit procedure must make the distinction between the auditor and certifying EMS professional clear unless they are one and the same. And one of the differences here, if you have an ISO 14001 system, you're going to be involved with a registrar, and probably an auditing team for 2 or 3 days on site, as opposed to, that, and maybe somebody such as myself, who's a Tier planner, but certified to do EMS audits and sign those reports. So they can be one and the same person, again, if it's not an ISO 14001. Significant aspects, pretty straightforward. All the toxic source reduction. Those are common words that we're used to in the TURA program. Things to consider before committing to an EMS in lieu of a TURA plan. Does your company currently have a real structured management system in place, such as maybe a 9001 quality management system? And why might this be important? It's a very structured approach. If your company already has one of those in place, it's pretty much company policy, and they're used to living under sort of the framework of one of these management systems. And that's very important, I think, as a major consideration for implementing one of these. The TURA EMS requires designating company individuals to manage the EMS scheduling and host annual meetings and participate in the biennial audits and associated meetings, including senior management. Now, they don't really have a choice, whereas in some companies, in companies with TURA plans, there could be an ISO quality management program in place, like a 9001 in the EHS department, and they run their company in accordance with their 9001 policies. But the environmental guy or gal or group, they're kind of a subset of that, and they're not thought of as one and the same. But with the TURA EMS, they pretty much get drawn into that. And one of the major requirements, just as the other management programs, senior management has to be involved, the same thing with the TURA EMS. And committing financial resources, it may cost less or more to prepare a TURA plan update as opposed to a TURA EMS. And let me say this in three ways at this point. If you already have an ISO 14001, somebody like me comes along and we're going to help you implement your TURA EMS, the cost is probably going to be less than it would be to do a TURA plan initially, because you already have your structure there. You're used to that structure. I showed you the comparative elements earlier, and the modifications aren't huge that have to be done to your ISO 14001 to bring it up to what meets the criteria for a TURA plan update. If you don't have an EMS in place, or let me put it this way, if you don't have an EMS in place and you're wanting to do a TURA EMS, you've got to develop that whole system. And at that point, it's going to cost at least, or maybe more, to actually implement a TURA EMS than it would to do a TURA plan update. And I know that's been a hurdle for some companies and some other consultants with whom I've spoken. They've called me and asked me about these things too as well. But then again, too, if it's an ISO 14001, I don't know why that happened, sorry. If it's an ISO 14001 program, again, you're dealing with the registrar, auditors on site for at least 1 to maybe 3 days, or even a week. I've seen those go for a week. That's a big cost. If it's a TURA EMS and it's not an ISO formal system, it would probably be somebody such as myself, who's a certified EMS auditor, to come on site and do that audit with you for probably maybe a third of that time, and or even less of that amount of time. And there's no registrar involved. See, so there are cost considerations to there as well. I just want to make everybody aware of. When might implementing an EMS in lieu of a TURA plan not be a good idea? If your company does not have a structured management in place, and why might this be important when a company already has a formal system? You're already acclimated to the extra responsibilities, time associated with implementing such a system. It's company policy, they've been living it. Without that, this adds a pretty good layer of responsibility, at least up front. The approach can be overwhelming to small, medium-sized companies where resources are already overburdened. And this applies to any of the EMS programs. If the company has a history of non-compliance with environmental agencies, why might this be a problem? If a company has not developed good practices for managing regulatory requirements, managing permit requirements, reporting requirements, implementing a TURA EMS is probably premature, right? Would you agree with me on that? Because if a company is getting NONs and ACOPs every 2 or 3 or 4 years, there's something about how they're managing their current regulatory compliance program that's not working. So if that's the case, where do you go from here? So as a first step towards creating a TURA EMS, EPA has what they call a compliance management system. And where does this really come from? If you discover that you have issues with TRI, you can file an e-disclosure online with EPA. But in order to file that e-disclosure to be forgiven of administrative issues, you have to do so under one of two policies, either a formal environmental management system or a compliance management system. And that's where it spells out all the details in that e-disclosure in terms of what a compliance management system contains. So it doesn't contain the complexity of the audits associated with Atura EMS, but there's still a lot of things you have to do here. So basically, the CMS mission is to maintain regulatory compliance with local, state, and federal environmental regulations, a mechanism for continuous improvement. This is an adaptive system. It's going to move all the time for the first year or two while you're getting in compliance. And what does it cover? Compliance policy, standards, procedures to identify how employees and agents might meet the requirements of laws, regulations, permits, enforceable agreements. And what is this system? It's basically going to be a big procedural manual. And yeah, again, you're supposed to have this in place or your EMS when you make your discovery before you go online for e-disclosure. If you don't have one of these two in place when you have your disclosures and you go online and you click, you did this as a result of an EMS audit or a CMS audit, that's the cart before the horse. And that's just not how this is supposed to work. So if you're going to do an extensive audit and you want a little protection up front to implement a CMS initially and get your arms around this is probably a very smart thing to do if you haven't had any type of a system. So basically, what does this include? It's going to include, well, first of all, you have to do an audit, an initial audit to see what your regulatory universe is. It's going to include all the specifics of your air permits, all the provisos and the air permits in terms of what you're going to do, when you're going to do it, SPCC plan, stormwater pollution prevention plans, all of your checklists, who's responsible for what, and then whoever else you need to get involved with that team and what their responsibilities are going to be. This
Bill?
is a compliance management system. Yes.
No, I'm sorry. We had just, this is a 1 minute warning.
Okay, thank you. All right, so basically, that's all I wanted to say there. So sometimes a CMS would probably be a better first step than an EMS if a company has a history of non-compliance. I just want to quickly show you in terms of the online reporting, we're all used to tour plan summary sheets. And we're dealing with options considered, those chosen for implementation, and looking at those over previous years. The difference once you get into an EMS progress report is you're looking at significant aspects. So provide a list of those. And as you see, there's a whole list of chemicals highlighted in light gray. And the last one, phthalic anhydride, used below reporting threshold, because again, if it has the potential, it has to be listed. So there it is. And you talk about your objectives and targets too as well in this. So it's actually a fairly complete report. And you have all of these items that you must be able to check yes to. And if you can't, then why did you check no? What do we need to do different? And number 9 at the bottom, I think this is important. What I wanted to point out to you is that this particular company, they're also looking at doing an energy conservation program at the same time under their EMS while doing tour reporting, because that's one of the benefits. Again, once you bring your tour planning, the elements of that into your Matura EMS and the company structure is already in place to do that, it's not so much of a new company philosophy to get that done. And you can prioritize what needs to be done first. Maybe you manufacture chemicals for a living. So the more you make, the more money you make. So you're not really going to look at reducing those, but you still have to report, but you don't like your environmental footprint from energy. So you can do those types of things. So I see this as being a benefit to a lot of companies who already have structured systems in place, and maybe not so much of a benefit to small, medium companies who've had a history of non-compliance. Maybe the CMS is the way to go. And that's it.
Thank you so much. And as Bill pointed out, the slides that have been uploaded to our website have a whole lot more detail embedded into the slides themselves. So if you want to look at those, that would be great. Bill, there's a couple questions in the chat and we don't really have time for that right now. So you might want to take a look. One of the questions though that, and somebody who prefers not to have his name mentioned has been answering. So that's been wonderful. But why don't we just let you, if you could stop sharing, I'll be able to share my screen. And then, yeah, just if you have any other questions about the Turi EMS and the specifics of how to implement it, you can go ahead and put those in the chat. And we've got Bill and Terry and Cindy and others who, Kathy, who, have experience with this, who can be able to answer. But what I want to do now is I want to hand this over to Sandra Wyman. And Sandra has done a number of resource conservation plans over the years, and she has put together a nice presentation to talk to us about what it is that she's done and why. So Sandra, if you don't mind sharing your video so we can see you, and you can take it away.
Are you running the slides for me?
I will run the slides for you. There you are.
We there?
Yep.
I don't see my slides.
Oh, okay. All right, stop sharing. I was sharing my screen. So I was gonna, okay. Let me run the slides for you and you can just tell me when to go to the next slide. Do you see it?
Yep.
Okay, go.
And does everybody see me?
Yes.
Okay. Hi, everybody.
Hey.
My name's Sandra Wyman. I've been doing resource conservation planning ever since it was offered as an alternative to toxic use reduction planning. And everything is a resource. As far as I'm concerned, energy, water, raw materials, waste can be a tremendous resource, as we'll see in some case studies I'm going to present. Money, and as I find with the passing days, time is a very valuable resource. Next slide, please. So the whole riddle to resource conservation planning is how to mine the highest return on whatever it is, whatever resource you're deciding to target. And these bullet items come into play while you're undertaking that task. You need to keep track of materials with a mass balance, energy with an energy balance. Benchmarking is vitally important in getting the proper benchmarks set up so that you can see if you've accomplished what your goal was. Regulatory screening is important because sometimes these resource conservation projects come along because of regulations, and sometimes they're hampered by regulations. So you have to be aware of what the regulatory environment is in your project that you're doing. The economics, if it doesn't have a payback, when you go into companies and industries, they want to know what's the payback. So you have to do an economic evaluation. And then this is something that oftentimes escapes the radar when you're doing especially energy conservation type projects. It's efficiency, and I'll touch upon that in a later slide. And does this sound like TUR to you? Because it really involves the same skills as toxic use reduction planning. It's just dealing with a different resource. Next slide, please. So I'm going to take you through 3 case studies to sort of show that one thing I've noted with resource conservation planning is that there's an integration that happens. So in this particular case, we're doing an energy conservation project, but it's involving raw materials and it's saving a lot of money, and it's having an ancillary value of reducing the company's carbon footprint. I did this presentation at an earlier Turi conference. There is a link on the slides that will be posted. So for the nitty-gritty details of this, you can click on that link on the Turi site. But what we did here was, this was a coating company that used organic solvents as a carrier for what they were coating, which was tinted window film. And they solvents got evaporated once the coating was laid down on the film substrate. And it was evaporated and burned in a oxidizer, which was stipulated by permit. They had to reach a certain amount of destruction of the organic solvents. Turned out that the solvents had the equivalent energy value of natural gas, just about 1-to-1. And so they captured this energy using an oxidizer called Clean Tech, which was manufactured at the time by Megtech, and they recycled it back to the process coaters. And this reduced their natural gas consumption, as you can see, to the tune of $1.2 million a year. Their carbon footprint dropped similarly because natural gas, when it's burned, produces carbon dioxide and water. So the natural gas dropped, you had a carbon dioxide drop. Next slide, please. Case 2 is near and dear to my heart. This is happening here in Maine. And this is a situation where we're having an issue with manure disposal. 8 million gallons a year. It's the largest dairy farm in Maine. And the DEP and the farmers worked out a solution. And the solution turned out to be putting in a biodigester to create energy. It's about a 4-acre site. You're looking down at the 3 circular domes there. Those are just rubber expandable lids on the digesters themselves. The 2 on the left are each 400,000 gallon capacity. The one on the right is 2.2 million. So we have a 3 million gallon capacity to treat the manure from the cows. It also treats 80,000 tons a year of food waste, which is gathered around the state at various places and brought here. And the building at the top part of the right picture is where the food waste comes in. So they're running these 3 biodigesters, converting the waste, the liquid waste coming out of the biodigesters after 15 to 20 days will go back on the fields to grow alfalfa and silage for the cows. And there is some solids that are produced, which goes to be cow bedding in the barns. The digesters run 40%, 60% mixture, and they make enough electricity for 1,600 homes. Next slide, please. And the third case is something I got involved in as an adjunct teacher in the engineering program at Southern Maine Community College, the water turbines. And this particular turbine that's pictured here is a Pelton water wheel, and it's a micro hydro turbine. I noticed that was at the end of Bill's presentation. And this water turbine is 99% efficient in transferring the energy from the water into electricity. Whereas when you think about it, panels, solar panels are around 15 to 20%. And and the windmills are only as good when the wind's blowing, but if you have a constant source of water and you put a Pelton water wheel on it, you'll get a great deal of extraction of energy. The 2 variables you have to evaluate when looking at like a micro turbine such as this is the pressure drop and the water flow. And it depends on those 2 variables. There's actually a sweet spot. We did some calculations in my class at the college, and I put the tail of 3 water wheels here, Joe, Dan, and Andy, and I put the top 2 rows there, the head and the flow. You can see Joe has not much pressure drop, but he has a lot of water, and Andy has a lot of pressure drop, but not much water, and Dan's kind of in the sweet spot. And that turned out down at the bottom to be the best return for kilowatt hours per month produced by this micro hydro turbine. So it does require the right fit to evaluate applications of these things. So now let's look at 2 industry examples. Next slide. This is the macro. This is a cogen facility in Westbrook, Maine. It generates 552 megawatts of electricity. Going back to the food waste biodigester, they're generating 3 megawatts of electricity, just to give you scale and comparison. A cogenerator has 2 turbines here, and this isn't exactly correct. The first pass uses the combustion gases. It's a General Electric turbine. You can Google General Electric if you're interested in it. But the first pass uses the combustion gases, and then the exhaust gases after the first pass have a lot of heat in them. And just like on that first case, the heat goes into a boiler, it creates steam, and that steam is used to drive a second pass turbine. So that's why it's called a cogen, because they're using the waste heat to run a second pass turbine. So they get kind of a 2-for-1. They're highly efficient. This plant can start up in 15 minutes. They're very good plants as far as they run on natural gas, and they're good to interplay with renewables because they have such a fast startup and shutdown ability. So I had some students over there. We're doing a field trip, and I knew they used a lot of water. They're either the largest or the second largest water user in Portland. And I was thinking water turbines as we were taking a field trip. And I was thinking, gee, you know, they have redundancy. You see the 2 stacks there. Because if one goes down for maintenance, they have to keep the power going. So they have 2 really power plants sitting side by side. And they have 2 huge headers coming in at the basement where the water's coming in. It's coming from Sebago Lake. And I'm thinking, gee, that's a lot of water. If a slipstream could be run through a little side water turbine, stepping down the line pressure, energy could be extracted. Next slide, please. In a way, you're riding on the backs of the water ratepayers of the Portland Water District who are pressurizing the water and pumping it into the power generating facility. So I did some math, and there's all the data, and it came up to 216,000 kilowatt hours a month. And yeah, we're dealing with a power plant, doesn't need any extra power, or does it? Because I walked through the plant and I had a look at their backup emergency setup, and I was thinking, well, gee, this would be a case where they could maybe use it during a brownout or another emergency. So now let's go to a smaller industrial example and look at an electroplating shop, because this was when I had my first epiphany, when I was getting interested in micro turbines and thinking, oh, wow, this would be really good in electroplating. They use lots and lots of water. Why not grab some of the energy as it comes flying into the shop? So I did the math there, and it came up to 725 kilowatt hours a month for 10 million gallons annually. Might help with the office lights, but I don't think it's going to be very good for the cathodes and the anodes in the tanks. They need a lot more. Next slide, please. So getting back to the macro example of the cogen facility, here are the intake water lines at Calpine. And while we were there, Forrest, the student on the left, he noted that the cooling towers there were losing tremendous amounts of water vapor because it's part of the Rankine cycle that generates the electricity in a plant such as Calpine. And he wanted to capture that water loss, those big plumes that you see going into the air. And I put him in touch with the engineer who runs the plant, and they spend $500,000 a year on water. And so Forrest decided that he came around 3 times on this project during the semester. He really dug into the data, and he had 2 or 3 different approaches on various things, but he came up with these fog nets that are used in arid climates up on the mountaintops in place of wells where you condense water. And he made an adaptation in SolidWorks on the right. And then he ran some math. Next slide, please. Next slide. Do we have a slide? Yeah, one more. No?
Sandra, I'm sorry, it looks like I don't have the next slide.
The next slide was, it would end up saving 30%. And it was, I believe, 100 million. Let me look at my slides here. Hold on a sec. I can open it up. I can grab that number for you real quick. So that number was, I don't have it, but it's about 100 million gallons a year
Wow,
was the potential water savings, just condensing using the fog mist gizmo.
really interesting.
Mm.
So,
I have it, it's from your slide, it's 108 million gallons.
Okay, I was close.
thanks. I don't know why I had the wrong slides, but it's the second time I've had the wrong slides for you, so I apologize.
So that's it.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So lots of great examples around why alternative planning could be a really good option. What I'd like to do is invite our panelists to share their videos, and I'm going to pin each of you so that you are kind of on the top of our screens. And I'm just going to have to keep going one at a time. What I'd like to do is to introduce Beth Fitzpatrick, who can talk a little bit about your experience in working with companies to implement alternative planning.
Hi, everyone. So I'm Beth Fitzpatrick. I work for RPS, which is an environmental consulting firm. And I've been able to certify RC plans since it came into the program. I'm also able to certify EMS, but I have not had a client use that option yet. For the RC plans, I've worked with multiple clients. I've done plans that have focused on water, waste, and electricity. Brian from MSI is actually one of the companies. His company focused on electricity at first, and then they've also done a water plan as well. So most of my clients where I've worked with them and they've been open to the RC option, it's typically a client where they either feel like they've got all the low-hanging fruit from their tour plans and they're just looking to do something different, or have a plan where they feel like they actually have progress, as opposed to just saying, yep, we can't get any further on this and and we'll check again later. And then I have other clients where they feel kind of frustrated by Tura. I know Pam doesn't like to hear that, but it's true. Where I have clients where they're in the program because they're beneficially recycling fly ash, and so they have to report on the lead, and they sort of feel a little picked on because they're beneficially recycling, but here they're in the toxic use reduction program. So they like to have that option to kind of step away from the TUR program every other planning cycle and sort of focus on something else. And another one of my clients sort of in a similar position where they're a power plant and their air permit says they have to use ammonia. So, you're not going to do things like substitution or whatnot when your air permit says you have to use this chemical. So most of the clients that I've had that have used the options, they're kind of either looking to do something different because they're not feeling like they have forward progress, or they just feel like they don't have too many options to start with.
Yeah, thanks. And no, I know you're always going to say those things. I don't mind at all, of course. But one of the clients that you have had great success with is Msi Transducers, and Brian Pazel has joined us. And Brian, we're so grateful that you're here and would really love to hear more about your experience in implementing resource conservation. So if you could just introduce yourself and your company to us and tell us what you're doing.
Well, thanks, Pam. Yeah, so I'm Brian Pazel from Msi Transducers. We've been in business since 1991. We're located in Littleton, Massachusetts, right off of 495. We make basically sonar transducers for a variety of marketplaces, commercial, defense. We split sort of 50-50 between commercial and defense. Our products are in a lot of marine applications, as you might think, and the defense. We're a very, very small company. We're about 30 people currently. We've gone through a couple of acquisitions over the last few years. We've gone up and down in the number of people. So it does present a unique environment. The material that we have to report on is lead. And different than some of the companies that Beth mentioned, is lead is in our product. And we manufacture a ceramic material called lead zirconate titanate, PZT, which is the active material in most transducers going back to the 1940s. You probably have a lot of these in some appliances and things at home. Your cell phones don't use PZT these days, but most kind of cheap speakers and buzzers and things in the old days used to use PZT. All sonar materials are really made out of PZT, and so we can't really. It's difficult for us to try to reduce the amount of lead that we process, especially if we want to grow our business. So as Beth said, it's been a little bit frustrating for us, being in business for 30 years, trying to come up with fresh ideas every so often on how we can reduce our waste streams or try to use alternative materials. Lead solder is one, for instance, that we have been able to look at, and some other things. But we find that looking at the alternative plans, the conservation plans, not only help us because we can do something a little bit more proactive, but in the case of the water, which is the most recent one, it was a little bit fun for the employees because they all get involved and get engaged in it. We can talk about more about that when we have the roundtable. Thank you.
Thanks, Brian. Really, really good introduction. And so next I'd like to invite Will Finch, who's here. Will works at CB Fisk, and it's always great to hear from our companies, and particularly to hear from companies we have not heard from before, and CB Fisk would be one of those. So Will, we're really grateful that you're here and would love to hear a little bit more about you and your company and what you've chosen to do.
Yeah, thank you, Pam. I've been in the pipe organ business since I was in high school back in '71, and worked for a couple different companies. I'm currently with CB Fisk. It's a company with about 20 employees. It's a craft type environment. We only build 2 or 3 instruments a year. And the pipes are made of a tin lead alloy. And so way back when, we had to start reporting the amount of lead that we were shipping each year. Sandra was a big help in getting us started on that road. We ship roughly between 2,000 and 8,000 pounds of lead a year. It fluctuates greatly depending on how large the instrument is. We ship instruments all over the world. And again, the final product is a an artistic endeavor for all of our employees. We build the instrument in the shop, take it all apart, ship it, and then the same people go on site and put it back together. The lead has been used for organ pipes since the beginning of time, 16th century. And it's also a long-lived material. So there are pipes that are still that old and still functioning. The footprint of our building, we're about 20,000 square feet. We, of course, have lots of woodworking machines, but the primary use of energy in our shop is electricity, and we can get into that at any time as part of our plan to reduce our footprint. So do you want me to go into that now, or?
Sure.
Yeah, so as you can understand, since we couldn't do a lot in terms of reducing the amount of lead, we were using, Sandra suggested we start looking into alternative plans. We've gone through a couple iterations of reducing electricity use with our lighting. You might think that we have lots of big woodworking machinery that consume a lot of electricity, but actually they're not running that often since it's a lot of handwork involved in our shop. So most of the energy is used by the lighting. And so our most recent project was to switch over to LED lighting, and that allowed our total kilowatt hours to drop about between 35 and 40%. We were consuming maybe around 7,600 kilowatt hours a month, and we dropped down to about 45, 60. And it was gratifying to be able to report that to the rest of the employees. You know, most of us are very interested in the environment and doing what we can to improve the situation. The other plan or program we got involved in last year is buying into a community solar program. We couldn't put the panels on our the roof of our building because it would have been too much money structurally to prepare it. But we were approached by a company from Solar on Earth, or a fellow from Solar on Earth, who works with Massachusetts solar farms. And so we basically pay the farm for the money. It's a national grid program that they're encouraging people to buy into this program. You know, it is a limitation. I'm always looking for ideas on what we can do next. But, you know, of course, things were very slow last year. So we, you know, our output dropped dramatically. And that's one thing that when we submit our reports at the end of the year, Sandra often has to explain, well, why is there such a big change in your output this year versus last? And why can't you reduce the amount of lead you're putting out? And it's really just mostly a question of timing and market, because it does fluctuate so much.
I'm sure Lynn appreciates those comments to help clarify.
Yeah. But that's about the story.
That's great.
Yeah.
Cool. Thank you, Will. And yes, definitely, I want to get into this some more with all of you. But first, I'd like to introduce Kathy Benjamin. And Kathy, I hope you're able to, you're good. All right. So Kathy works at Jetex Optics in Dudley, and they are part of a Essilor Corporation, and they have opted to use the Tura EMS option. And Kathy, would love to hear some more about you and you know, your experience with that.
Good afternoon, everyone. Yeah, Jetex Optics produces lenses. These are the lenses that we all use to see the world better. The motto here is improving lives by improving sight. We manufacture through injection molding polycarbonate lenses. We blend non-scratch coatings in order to protect those lenses while they're in transport. We also make polar and tinted wafers for sunwear. And we make the inserts that are the real science behind the lens. We got involved with the EMS because it just made practical sense for us, because we were doing an EMS because it was mandatory by Essilor for all of its facilities. We were already having 2 mandatory third-party audits. So we took advantage of that by including the Tura elements in those audits. We have done lots of projects for reducing our energy use, reducing our water use. Because of the fact that we are making coatings and we are using coatings for the protection of our lenses, and our volumes are going up, reducing our one reportable chemical we hit the wall like everyone else eventually experiences, I believe. So we've taken advantage of using our EMS to help us with communication to our employees and using the system itself to help us meet the requirements of the global operation. We're owned by a French company, and sustainability is the law, and it does affect the stock price, so it has an economic value to it for sure. We are held accountable for meeting our targets and objectives. And of course, like everything that's built around targets and objectives, they get harder to do every year. And so we have to find the financial monies to meet those objectives. None of this is driven by Tura. So we use our system that really fit Tura in so that we can meet the requirements here in Massachusetts.
That's great. And, you know, that really was the intention of the Tura EMS option, to allow businesses to use their existing strategies to manage their use of toxic chemicals. So thank you guys all so much. And what I want to do is just ask a couple questions, but I want to also encourage everybody joining us here today, if you have questions, to post those on the chat or to raise your hand. And I also want to encourage our panelists to feel free to ask each other questions, because you've all had, you know, experience with these different alternatives. And so we just want to kind of have this very open and very interactive. So I want to just kind of follow up with you, Kathy, first, maybe. So you are part of a larger corporation, and so there was more of a drive for Gentex to do the Tura EMS option because you already had an EMS. And I know, Bill, you had mentioned that you thought that the Tura EMS might not be as attractive for a smaller company. And I wonder, Kathy, what your thoughts are on that. You're on mute.
Here, there we go. I'm looking for the unmute button. Well, we have 444 employees. We only have 37 non-production employees, but certainly we do take advantage of talents across all of our resources. I can tap into, for instance, our quality team. They do a lot of the internal audits. For instance, this year, we're because of COVID, last year we weren't able to transition from 18,000 to 45,000. Well, this year by June, we will make that transition. And our quality systems team, which is responsible for the 9,000 system, helped us transition into the new, 14,001, and they're also right there helping us transition into 45,001. So I think if you do have an EMS, no matter what your size is, you can make this work. I don't think there's additional cost to it. If you already have a registrar that's external. If you're only doing it internal and you need that external auditor, then you're probably going to have some costs. But wouldn't it be cool? And I think, I don't think companies think about this too much, but if there's someone from another company that's small that has the EMS certification, like for instance, Bill, he can be that outside auditor. but we could also use our peers, and maybe Bill won't want to hear that, but there's other creative ways to do this.
Right. Good. Thank you. So one of the things that we know with resource conservation is, well, there's been a lot of concern about the amount of time that goes into doing both a resource conservation plan and then every other cycle doing a toxic use reduction plan. Beth, what is your take on that? And Sandra, you too as well.
So I find most of my clients are willing to do that because they feel like they get more forward progress out of the resource conservation plan. So, yes, it costs a little bit more to maintain 2 plans, but the economic payback that you get from implementing some of these resource conservation options, more than covers that additional cost to maintain 2 plans. And I think just from a standpoint of they're paying a consultant to do something, I think they feel better paying the consultant to, assist with the plan where you feel like you have progress versus a plan where, you go through the motions and you really put a good faith effort in. And at the end of the day, you find that there's not much more forward progress that you can gain from the TUR plan. So I think for me and my set of particular clients, it's not really been an issue regarding that extra expense to maintain 2 plans.
Sandra, what do you think? You're on mute.
Yeah, I was looking for the unmute square. There are pros and cons. I think the pro is there's tremendous savings and payback to take on resource conservation projects. I think one of the nits against it is the cycle just drives me nuts. Every 2 years you skip, and when you do that, you've lost focus. And one company had me continue to do it regardless of, you do have to put in a progress report. I missed doing that with a client the last cycle because I'm like, we were on the chemical other year, but they needed a summary, but I had already hit the submit, or they'd hit the submit, and it was submitted and you can't go in and edit. And so I had to find a form somewhere and send it in. So the cycle of it could be improved. Just make it, just bless it for maybe a 10-year window. So you have 5 rounds of something if you've got a real ambitious project, or even I'd take, 2 cycles in a row or 3 cycles in a row, because it seems like we're just getting up to steam, and then bang, you're changing, you're distracted and you're not staying on point. So.
Mm-hmm. So, you are not the first person to express that as well. And one of the things that we worry about is that the company, by focusing only on resource conservation, might really lose momentum and steam and understanding of their toxic use reduction opportunities. And because we know that things change, technology changes and chemistry changes, that's a concern. Now, Brian and Will, you're both dealing with lead, and you have both pointed out that you're using lead because it has very specific characteristics. But I wonder if you have any thoughts on the toxic use reduction planning side of things and that question of momentum.
Yeah, I'll speak first to that. I think in a lot of ways, our company doesn't have a lot of momentum because it's such a slow process. And so it really isn't too hard to switch back and forth between the two, reporting, needs. But I don't know. Yeah, I guess that's what I feel. Yeah.
Okay. Brian?
So I
Can I
would-
just ask, I'm sorry, can I just
Go ahead.
ask Will a question?
Sure.
I'm sorry. I'm just curious. Is there, could you tell us, you just can't make pipe organs without lead?
Yes, that's true. There's several different alloys that we use, but they all have lead in them. Some are almost pure lead and some are almost pure tin. But the pipe needs to be malleable so that it can be voiced properly. And we're one of the few companies that make all of our own, or almost all of our own metal pipes, and also most of our own wooden pipes. There are
Uh-oh.
Oh dear.
wooden pipes and pipe organs, and these larger ones. And the Europeans tried to limit the use of lead in pipe organs many years ago, and just ran up against a brick wall when they approached the pipe organ business, and so they had to issue waivers for organ companies and perhaps others.
Well, it's very interesting. Thank you.
Sure.
So, so Brian, what are your thoughts on the lack of momentum or the interruption of momentum?
Yeah, so I think my sentiments are similar to Will's, is that I don't feel, especially after being in business for 30 years and scrutinizing our products and our waste stream. Really, all we can do is reduce our waste from year to year, and that's very, very hard to do after 30 years. And so I don't really feel like we have much momentum. And also the point is that we look at a return on investment on our ideas in a 1 to 2 year cycle. So we don't have long-term plans on how to implement like waste reduction over 5 or 10 years that maybe, multiple cycles would interrupt how we actually perform on those. It's sort of every year we look at it, from a fresh start and try to come up with new ideas and then try to implement those ideas on a yearly basis to take advantage of a 1 year return on investment cycle.
So in a way, the cycle, the 2 year cycle kind of fits your business model.
Yeah, it kind of refreshes the whole system because it really gets tiring to year after year. It's kind of funny because we've had some turnover in about the last 4 or 5 years. Our company was actually sold and shrunken, and then the company that bought us went bankrupt and we sold ourselves again. And then we've grown back to our original size. So about half of our employees are brand new. And it was very interesting in the last cycle to see that all the ideas that we generated were basically repeats of things we had looked at 10 and 20 years ago. New people are submitting them, but it's the same ideas, and we really have no fresh approaches on how to reduce our lead waste.
Interesting.
I was just going to make another comment that you said before about the cost of this. And I don't think for us, at least, we're a very small business. And what we like to do is engage the whole company in Tura. We do have a team that focuses on it and works with our planners to come up with our numbers and our reporting. But when it comes to coming up with ways to reduce lead or the conservation plans, we open it up to the whole company. And every year what we do is we run a contest where anyone who submits an idea for Tura gets a $5 gift card. And then we find the top 3 solutions that we really like, whether we implement it or not, but we just like to reward the people who had the best ideas. We give them like a $75 or a $50 gift card to somebody. And so, alternating years like that and coming up with the water conservation was really great for a couple of reasons. One was like I said, it's a fresh approach. It's not the same, oh, what are we going to come up with this year? But also, everyone can relate to water conservation. Some of the best ideas we got were from a receptionist who doesn't even work with lead, where that person who's not working with the materials really wouldn't have much input to reducing lead waste because they don't work in that area. But everyone in the company could contribute to this. The other thing we did, which is a little different with the conservation, is that we did a study at the beginning. So we basically looked at every place in the building that we used water, and we try to quantify how much water we used on a daily basis. And the obvious things were things like cooling water for machines, some other things where we had to wash things and clean them. But it turns out, and this is how everyone was involved, one of the things that we did was to monitor the water usage in the bathrooms. And we put a sign-up sheet on the door, and every time somebody washed their hands or flushed a toilet, they had to put a little mark on the door, and we kept track of that for about a week. And it turned out in the end that, and we estimated how long people were going to use to, wash their hands and things like that. In the end, it turned out that the bathroom was using the most amount of water in our building. And so what we did then is we took all the data that we generated and gave it to the employees and said, okay, now come up with ideas how to conserve water in these areas.
Mhm.
And we got some really good ones. The wastewater is again a big one, but the costs, to reduce that, like a chiller, is $30,000 or $40,000, and our annual water bills are only about $5,000 or $6,000. And so, we're probably only going to be able to reduce our water by $2,000 or $3,000 a year with a $30,000 piece of equipment. So, turns out this year we're actually ramping up our molding capabilities quite a bit, and so we are going ahead and purchasing a chiller for that reason, because we're going to be using like 10 times what we were the previous year, kind of thing. But so the answer is, it's like a breath of fresh air for the employees to get them more engaged, and it really didn't cost us very much.
Yeah, I mean, that's, I think, a really important point. Kathy, you had a point to make. Go ahead.
Yeah, somehow my mute button keeps coming undone, and I don't know what I'm doing. But speaking of water use and energy use, one of the benefits that we have with our organization, and I think anyone who belongs to an organization that's global, is you get to share best practices with your folks across the pond. And we've been able to implement what are smart meters. So going back to, I think it was Will or said something about, and no, I guess it wasn't Will, maybe it was Sandra, about the length of the period that the resource conservation, it's just too quick. With my own experience, I would say, wow, yeah, for sure. Because when we take a look at our data collection, installing these smart meters, and where to put them, it's over years, and it costs a lot too. And what we'll be able to get from that is a baseline to compare like processes with all of our sister plants across the globe. And then when you're looking at best practices, they begin to make more sense because you have the data. So while putting smart meters for electrical and water and waste and all of that doesn't save a thing with respect to energy per lens or liters per lens, waste per lens, it puts you in a better position for your study so that in the future you can make those big gains by sharing with your sister plants what the best practices are. So going back to what Sandra said, you get rid of all the fruit that's easy. Now comes the hard stuff. And with the hard stuff, you really need data. And to get the data, you have to install equipment that costs bucks. And it takes time, and it takes your engineering staff to work with you. The system that we're putting in won't even be the IT part of it, that the brains of it's not even installed in our facility. It's in Brazil at our sister plant. We're going to be able to utilize the technology from another plant to get the data for our own plant. That's amazing.
Yeah. And best practices, you're absolutely right. And the question of data really harkens back to our conversation this morning around materials accounting. How do you get the right data for what you're trying to assess and how effective you are. Sandra, go ahead. You're on mute.
Unmute, yeah. To Kathy's point, when I'm teaching and in the consulting thing, I've come up with what I call a universal benchmark. And another fellow who had developed a smart meter was selling it here in Maine to residences so that it worked through the phone and they could see the energy consumption in their house. He had a way of wiring it into the circuit breaker in the cell phone. And he liked the universal benchmark as well. And he said, I think I'm going to borrow that idea. And basically what I do is you can take all of your energy uses, whether you're in a home or in a company, or you can define a project boundary. And you might use natural gas. For example, what I used in my example in class was I used some wood, I used some oil, I use some propane. So I take all those energies and I work in the efficiency, which I touched upon in my presentation. And I figure out what is my net cost, what is my net use of energy for my project boundary, which was my house. So I have actually $1 per million BTU cost. And I have 1 million BTU per degree day because most of my energy in this house is spent heating it. We used the same technique at an industry and they were far more efficient because they were burning natural gas and they were much more efficient. The wood stove was an old one, which I've since replaced, but this universal benchmark, I feel, could be very valuable because it's sort of like the Energy Star. You can go around and say, well, what's your benchmark? And everybody's got either $1 per million BTU they're spending on their project window, or for me, I'm looking at that. I've been tracking degree days since 1988, and I have millions of BTUs per degree days. I have the chart. And I'm trying to force that down right now in this house. And probably those windows are going to go and a few other things. So yeah, once you get the universal benchmark and you compare it, like I was comparing it to my clients where I did it, I was humbled. And then some of my students did some projects and brought in their universal benchmarks. And I felt like I had to take and do something with a wood stove. I was just so shamed. From going through that exercise. So I think that's kind of a sort of like throwing down the gauntlet, and everybody's got pride, and that's a big motivator for people to take action. And I think if you've got a benchmark or a metric that people can check and see how they're doing, it's sort of like, I don't know, running a race, weight loss, you go in and weigh in every week. Everybody can check the benchmarks and they can say, I could do better than that. Look at so-and-so. Or one time I was reading about people, immigrants in Portland, and what they paid in their food costs per week. And I was absolutely humbled again. So I had to take a look at my food prep and my shopping, because I couldn't believe what a family of 4 or 5 was living on compared to what I was spending on my groceries. I felt really ashamed there too.
Well, you guys are raising a point that I think is really important, and that is a question around like motivation and pride and engaging with your employees in a way that gets them excited about the work that's happening. And Brian and Will, I think you both could kind of speak to that. Yep, we're almost done. But I'm curious what, with respect to your workforce, has doing resource conservation, how has it affected them? And then beyond just your workers, are there customer or investor, stakeholders who are paying attention to these kinds of things? So Will or Brian, Will, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say that since our craft is very traditional, it's, we go to Europe and study old instruments there to to get our inspiration. And so in that sense, we're not really an innovative kind of industry. We're very traditional. And this process of searching for alternative energy uses, it's really helped us kind of get out of the box and start thinking creatively. And I think it's helped, the company kind of branch out and see the different aspects of the world and energy use, and kind of get out of our own, because it's such a out of the way craft. It's not a normal kind of thing. And many people they're always amazed that we can be doing this for year after year, and they never know how many organ companies are around. They don't think there's any at all. And so I think it's helped, broaden our perspective a lot.
Great, cool. Brian, do you have any comment on that?
It's an interesting question. I actually never thought of it. So we're owned by another company in New Hampshire. They don't do Tura. Tura is a Massachusetts thing, so they don't have to worry about this. But they do have to handle waste and things. And so, they look at it from a different perspective. How much money are we investing so you can do this? They see the cost of Tura, and they often question, why are you still in Massachusetts? But the one thing you did raise that maybe we can take advantage of is make some awareness to our customers. So this tends to be just a local thing. We deal with it every year. We don't publish it. We don't, publicize it. We just deal with Tura. But maybe in the future, if we, find that we're reducing our waste stream or saving money, we can find a way to use that for some publicity. Good
Yeah,
point.
interesting. And I don't think you joined us, Brian, but our keynote presenter was talking about environmental justice, and that's a lot about engaging with your communities. And so there were just some concepts there about how best to engage with your communities.
Well, so our local community is different because we do engage quite a bit with the town of Littleton. First of all, we're on a special permit here because the town aquifer is about 100 feet behind the building here. And so, they are concerned about us polluting their water supply, which we've never had an incident in the 30 years we've been here. But we also work very closely with local fire and police department, especially the fire departments. And we bring them in at least once a year to talk and to, walk through our facilities and look at things. So again, it puts us in a position where instead of trying to be an adversary with the community, we want to work with them and try to help.
Right,
So.
good. Bill, you had your hand raised.
Yeah, I just wanted to cover a couple of things if I could quickly. I know we're almost out of time. Ed asked a question earlier about do you have to get your ISO 14001 plan recertified if you add your Tura chemicals to it? I've only run into this situation once, and initially when I did their Tura EMS for them, they had a 14001 system in place, ISO 14001. They were certified, so they were hesitant and reluctant about doing it for fear it was just going to throw a wrench in the cogs and it was all going to get messed up. And they looked into it, and that's when they were owned by a United States company. And they came back after a few weeks and said they don't really have any issue. We're going to go ahead and do this because it's a Massachusetts requirement. And then they were bought out by a global company a few years later. And then there was that same fear by the new people who came in, some of the new players, and they went back to their parent company abroad and people in charge of the ISO 14001. And after about 3 weeks, they came back and said the same thing. These are requirements that are United States specific to the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. We're not going to get in the way of that. Now, I guess there's been some chatter from other consultants that it's been a problem with ISO 14001. I haven't run into it. So I would say you'd have to speak to your registrar, Ed, and just run everything by them and see what they think. They might say, no, hey, we're going to go ahead and put it in. And then the next time we do an audit, we'll take a look at things and just make sure we feel like everything's balanced. I don't think it's going to be an issue for you.
Mhm, mhm.
And then last but not least, you asked me to save this till the end, so I'm just going to paste it in now and post this. But this morning, after I made the comments that I did about production ratio versus activity ratio, I had somebody call me and I'd left them confused. So I thought what best to do is to actually put the citation that I go to, which is EPA's 2020 TRI instructions, page 98. It talks about the activity ratio. And I just put some examples in there that meet the criteria to be labeled as an activity ratio versus a production ratio. And we've talked about plating facilities so far as one of them. So I think that holds true. And if it's a brewmaster or if it's somebody working in the food industry, they're going to have clean in place. And that's not process related for what they do. Or if they're making chemicals that are going to be supplements, then when they're doing their CIPs, that's not process related. And then of course, waste treatment's not process related. So those are all activity ratios. And,
Thanks.
that's all I wanted to add. Thank
Yeah,
you.
no, thanks for sharing that. Listen, we do only have a few minutes left, but I feel badly that we haven't gotten questions from others here. Let's see, Sherry Gaudette mentions that we do a Tira EMS at her company and address the process in their legal and other requirements and the planning process for ISO 14001 2015. But I really do want to invite others on the call to ask questions if you have any, or anyone, any of our panelists, if you have other thoughts that you want to make sure that we cover. Liz, go ahead.
So I just wanted to ask Brian, I believe that your company came up with a really creative way to reduce your lead use. And in fact, I think we gave you a grant to help implement it over a couple of years. And I was wondering whether that innovation came about by one of the great creative ways you have of getting all your employees involved.
Yeah, so actually the idea for that, so let me back up. So we injection mold our ceramics to net shape, which is one of the things that we do, but we do have a grinding process at the end. And the idea that we got with the grant is to basically take this plate that we use to hold some of the structure together and turn it into a waffle pattern with a bunch of holes. And so we were able to reduce, I don't know, 20 or 30% of the waste in that part. And we had created the initial design 15 or so years ago for that, but the cost, because our tools cost between $20,000 and $40,000 to manufacture, we hadn't implemented that really in many of our tools in our designs. And so with the grant that we had, we were actually able to implement that in 2 additional designs. And then I think we did a 3rd one with our own money the following year. And so it did greatly reduce the waste in that. It wasn't a new idea, but that was a financial situation where the amount of money that the Tura grant gave us, we didn't have to do an ROI on it, basically because we were getting the money from the state.
Mm-hmm. And that it really highlights the point that looking back at your ideas as you progress through the years is valuable, because what wasn't technically feasible before or what wasn't economically feasible before might be now. And certainly taking advantage of resources like grants from the Tura program or energy, incentive programs or what have you, are always worth thinking about. I want to kind of wrap up with one thought, and that is that what I have always felt is that toxics use reduction and resource conservation really calls on a creative problem-solving side of us that is fun. You know, it's fun to find solutions. It's fun to bat around ideas and try to create them. You know, Sandra shared a story about working with students, and students are really into the fun of finding new ideas and thinking outside of the box. And I want to encourage everybody to do that. Whether it's with your traditional toxic use reduction planning, or if you are considering doing an alternative planning, to really, you know, engage with the creative energy in your company, and see what comes out of it. But again, I just want to thank each of our panelists. I really appreciate it. I think you gave us a really nice overview of the reasons why or why not to do alternative planning. It's not for everyone. We don't expect that everyone would do it, but we really want to encourage all of our companies and all of our planners to consider it. So thank you all so much for sharing your thoughts on this, and thank you all for joining us. I'll be sending out the survey in about an hour.